Well, good evening, everybody. I want to continue our study with literary devices in the Bible, and wanted to look at something that I kind of took an amalgamation of different ideas of, like, what should I call this thing? And so this is what I landed on: pattern design. And the reason is this: the Bible consists of these various styles of literature. We have narrative, poetry, rhetorical arguments, and speeches. And they're all chosen by their respective authors as a means of conveying what the author intended to their readers. And what's curious to me is how there are patterns within these various forms. Now, if it sounds a lot like motif, it's probably because it is pretty similar to motif. The way that I kind of picture it, though, is this is a more general understanding. It's not maybe this one abstract concept. It's kind of like, we're going to look at this, then look at that, and see if this same pattern kind of repeats. These patterns, I believe, were inspired by God for the authors to use in their writings, and they demonstrate to us some interesting things. Here, the authors have taken various story elements, like character, setting, and plot, and created a series of repeated patterns. And they weave through multiple stories that span the Bible and unify them. And as we examine these patterns, you may begin to notice how different stories spanning the Bible have been coordinated to emphasize specific key themes. So when we're looking at these patterns, how can we detect them? It may not seem so easy at first because there's such an enormous amount of content within the Bible. But if we focus on key words, phrases, or even certain images that recur, we may begin to see how they're linked together. These are some of the biblical narratives that we're going to examine tonight. So just kind of prep yourself for them, if you will. And what I'm going to ask is, what patterns do we see that continue to recur through these different scenarios, through these different events in the Bible? Okay, so I'm going to start off with a familiar one, and that's the one of Adam and Eve and the fall. Excuse me, having trouble clearing my throat. So in Genesis, we read that God created the whole universe and placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And he described his creation as good and told both Adam and Eve that they were to have dominion over the garden and could eat whatever plant they wanted except for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then the serpent appears and convinces Eve that she should take some of the forbidden fruit. And in Genesis 3:6 it says, "When the woman saw that the tree produced fruit that was good for food, was attractive to the eye, and was desirable for making one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate it. Adam also ate of the fruit, and both of them were cursed because of their decision. The fruit they desired to take against God's will led to their own destruction." So now I want to look at the next scene here. And that's Abraham and the son of promise. And I left it kind of vague that way because that's what we're going to drive at. What can we maybe try and figure out as far as a commonality between the fall of Adam and Eve and this scenario with Abraham? And now I know we're going to come up with a wide range of answers, and that's what I'm hoping for, just like last week. Or 2 weeks ago. I really appreciated all the different answers. It really helped me to think and start making some other connections. What can we see as far as commonalities between what happened in the garden with Adam and Eve and how Abraham reacted when it came to God's promise of a son? Yeah. I was going to say it was a tie, so y'all can pick. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry? Human reasoning? Can you explain that? Okay, so to repeat what she had said, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I had trouble hearing you a little bit. We have human reasoning stepping in place of God's will. You have the serpent more or less deceiving Eve into taking this fruit. And Eve kind of comes up with her own reasons. Well, it's good for food, it looks good, and it will make me wise. So maybe this isn't so bad after all. In the same way, Sarah offered Hagar to Abraham, and that was through their own human reasoning that this should occur. Any other thoughts as far as the link between those two?
Part of it was, along with what Carla said, is human reasoning as far as Adam or Eve did not consult God, probably could have. The same with Adam and Sarah, where Adam probably and Sarah could have consulted God. Is this what you mean by having the child through my handmaid?
Okay.
And I'm sure he could have said, no, there's something better coming down the pipe.
So perhaps a refusal to seek God's counsel? Okay. A refusal or failure to seek God's counsel. Janine? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry, one more time. I'm talking over you, Janine.
In both cases,
Yeah.
lack of trust in what he told them.
Absolutely. A lack of trust with respect to both of these scenarios. What else do we see, if anything? Christina?
I don't want to go here because I am a female, but in both cases, it was the female's idea.
Hey.
It was their idea that they approached their husbands and said, hey, why don't we do this?
You're not wrong. I don't necessarily think that maybe that was the intention, but that's possibly worth exploring. I'll just leave it at that. This is what I kind of surmised, and it echoes definitely some of the opinions we've heard. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation. But we can read that Abraham worried about how that was going to happen, specifically how he was going to have a child. He was childless even in his old age. And so Sarah, I'm sure, heard or at least suspected the same thing, and she comes up with the plan, it seems, based on reading the text, that Abraham should take Hagar. I want to hammer a point here. Abraham took Hagar at Sarah's direction. Hagar ultimately gave birth to Ishmael. Ishmael became a nation. And if we read in Psalms, it says that the Ishmaelites were an enemy of Israel, and they sought to destroy them. So maybe now we're starting to see some patterns coming out. We only have 2 so far, and there's 4 more to go, so don't worry if you're not seeing it just yet. So Aaron and the golden calf. And the focus here is on Aaron, right? So what kind of commonalities can we see with this, with the other 2? Vance? Okay. Do we have any other ideas? Charlie?
Again, Aaron took direction from someone other than God.
Yeah, Aaron took direction from someone other than God when he made this happen. Anything else? Susan?
They all had consequences. Those were mentioned.
What kind of consequences are we talking about? Absolutely. They're all negative consequences, right?
Same with, like, kind of a theme of, I know God said this, but this isn't too far off, and it's sort of what he said, so it's probably okay.
Sort of this rationality or compromising, perhaps, of God's will. You know,
Kind of like, we can make this happen.
okay. Yeah, taking God's will into your own hands, perhaps. Mitch? Lack of patience, yeah, I can definitely see that with a lot of these. Any other thoughts? All right, it seems like we're starting to hone in on this already. I'm starting to hear with some of the answers. So Aaron did not trust God enough to wait for Moses. That was part of the problem, was that Moses was up on Mount Sinai, and they believed essentially that he was dead and he was never coming back. So Aaron, at the people's request, because they're like, well, help us out, we don't know what's happening. And Aaron says, give me all your gold, and I will show you the God that brought you out of Egypt. Ultimately, he fashions this golden calf or golden bull, whatever translation you want to use, and he deems it as the God that brought them out of Egypt. God, in response, sent a plague to punish Israel. There's probably a lot of other consequences that came from that. We just don't have enough time to dwell on that. But ultimately, plague is sent upon the people. God even talks about how his anger is so insinged against them that he will not be in their presence any longer, and he have to send an angel before them instead of the Lord himself. So pretty interesting. All right, the sin of Achan. He's one of those really minor characters within the Old Testament. Maybe we remember, maybe we don't. I had to read it to refresh my memory. But if you don't, Achan had something happen with some treasure, and it's in Joshua chapter 7. Yeah, chapter 7. What do we know about Achan, and how would this relate to these other passages?
They were told not to take the plunder, right? And he did, and then they lost battles until he was found out.
Right. You remember specifically which battle it was?
Was it Ai or something?
No, it was another big city, though. Vance might have it. Jericho, yeah, Jericho. So, as a refresher, the Israelites, being led by Joshua, they go to Jericho. And they conquer Jericho, and God specifically says, you will not take certain plunders, specifically gold and silver. It says, those are to be dedicated to me. The Lord says that, right? And so they conquer the city. Presumably they do what God tells them to do, and then they go and they try to conquer another city. But immediately they're met with resistance and are pushed back. And Joshua realizes something terrible has happened. Something's gone wrong, and he consults the Lord about what's happened. And God tells him, somebody's disobeyed what I've said. And then the Lord helps them seek out who it was, and ultimately land on Achan as the violator. Achan confesses, he says, I took a cloak, 200 pieces of silver, and a gold bar for himself, and he had buried it in the sand by his tent. And then ultimately he is stoned because of this. And that was the sin of Achan. What do we see as far as a commonality here? Yeah.
They're given specific directions from God.
Mm-hmm. So and then what happens?
Well, then they didn't, they went against it.
Yeah, they chose not to. I thought I saw a hand over here. Maybe not? No? Okay. And it might be an answer we've already said. What are we seeing here? What are the commonalities?
It's the desire that fills a specific need. So, he has this desire for this stuff. Yeah, God said no to it, but this is what I want. With Abraham, it was this is what I want, and God said it's going to happen, but I know how to make this happen. And then with Adam and Eve, it was this is what I want,
Mm-hmm.
and I need you to fill a desire for me.
Very well said. Mitch, you have your hand up?
Maybe trust in the seen versus the unseen.
For sure. I can definitely see that. No pun intended. Okay, so we already went over that. God commanded the Israelites to set them apart. Achan didn't do that, and Israel suffered a defeat. Ultimately, Achan was destroyed, right? That was his punishment for this. King Saul. What can we see about King Saul? And just for clarification, we're talking about the entirety of King Saul's existence within this story, from before he was king until he was no longer king. What do we see? Christina?
And you're seeing somebody trying to do it God's
For sure.
doing it the human way. Oh, here, let me hold it.
Yeah.
Whereas God's like, you don't touch things, like, stop.
Yeah, Saul was definitely guilty of that in many instances. This one's a little bit tougher, and I'll take the blame for that. I didn't probably preface this the right way. How about the coronation of King Saul? What's the backstory about how Saul came to be king? What were the events leading up to Saul? Go ahead. I got. Go ahead.
The people begged for him,
Okay. People beg for.
like the other nations.
Okay. Vance. Okay. Okay. I thought I saw another hand over here. Vicky? No? Okay. What kind of a specific term or word can we keep seeing in these events though? Like you're dead on, but what's a word that we could use? What did the people do to have Saul as their king? What did they do with him? They rejected God first and foremost. And God even says that outright. So what did the people do when they rejected God? They another T word, they took Saul to be their king, right? They complained that they wanted a king to rule over them. And just as Roger said, God tells Samuel the people have rejected him as king. And so the people took Saul as their king. Ultimately, Saul's reign is short. It's only 2 years, and it is absolutely marred by sin and destruction. Right? That was predicted even when Samuel was trying to convince the people this was not the way they wanted it to be. David and Bathsheba. Same question. What type of commonalities can we see? Yeah. Okay. Specifically what? Yeah, definitely. For those of us familiar with the story, David commits adultery with Bathsheba. What other commonalities do we see here? Yeah.
David tries to hide his sin, kind of like what Adam does in the garden when he's trying to hide from God.
That's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about that before. But yeah, there is that link. What else do we see with this pattern? Achan? That's how I pronounce it. Yeah, it's true. It's true. So Achan even tried to conceal his sin. Clay?
1 John 3 hits him on the nail on the head, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life.
Yeah, and that goes all the way back to Genesis with Eve taking the fruit, right? Vance, you got like a halfway hand there. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm keying on. Justin? He stole it from you. I'll count it to you, though. Vance has talked too much. So Justin said that. Yeah, the interest of kind of keeping things moving here. David sees Bathsheba bathing and desires her even after learning that she's married to Uriah, one of his soldiers. And so and this is what the text actually says. So David sent messengers and took her. David has Uriah killed in battle in order to cover up his sin. And then God tells David, quote, "The sword shall never depart from your house because of his sin." Ultimately, what happened with David's family? It just went off the rails, absolutely off the rails, and it was no longer the true Davidic dynasty that God wanted it to be, and it was because of David's sin. So these are some of the commonalities that I kind of came up with on my own. I'm more than happy to hear others. We have a lack of faith shown in God, right? From each one of these were people who either failed or refused to follow what God said because of their lack of faith. They put their own self-will above God's will. You know, time and time again, each one of them thought, well, maybe I can do it. Oh, Terry left. Maybe I can do it my way, and it'll be okay. Maybe I can do it my way just this once, and it'll be all right. Maybe God won't notice if I do it my way just this once. And again, the fleshly desires that all of them yielded to ultimately lead to their destruction. They cause some sort of consequence, and it's usually pretty lethal, pretty brutal in many cases. Do we see anything else with these so far? Yeah. What other commonalities do you notice with all of these different scenarios that we put? Maybe you don't see any others, and that's fine. But these are some that I came up with, just as a summary. Yeah, Mary. None of them followed God, of course not. And I think that could probably be best summed up in Ecclesiastes, right? You know, fear God, and that's the whole of man. And they chose not to do that for some reason.
All of these sins have led to severe consequences,
Yeah,
depending on one's perspective.
sure. Yeah. Some maybe not as severe, but nonetheless, still pretty severe. Some of them, we probably don't even know the full extent of what happened with them because of it. It's just not revealed to us. What might be just like one thread, one common thread that you could just run through all of them and say, like, this is what this pattern demonstrates to us? We have any idea? Mona?
Sin causes ultimate separation from God.
Yeah, that's one for sure. Sin causes ultimate separation from God. Do we see any others? Dana?
We don't, as humans, honor the position of God and recognize that He is God and we are not.
Yeah, yeah. We don't give God the proper due. We don't honor His authority and His perspective on these things. The one common thread that I guess I kind of lump it in together is simply the tragedy of the human condition. And I say it because of this. We see this time and time again through the Old Testament, right? This is only 6 examples. I could probably pull out some more, just like you guys could probably pull out some more. But we see this cycle repeating over and over and over again, right? And if it ended there, it would just be a sad story. There's nothing else to look forward to in this. So in fact, the repetition almost pushes the reader to ask, will this pattern ever be broken? So how is this pattern design shown with a positive outcome? That's the question. How do we see it? Chris?
Despite man's best efforts, God's will is still carried out.
For sure. God's will is still carried out. It's an interesting way of looking at it. Even under, humans' limited influence on these scenarios, God's will is still carried out. Do we see another pattern after these that has a positive outcome? I heard somebody say it just before. Yeah, the second grade answer, right? Or the 5-year-old answer. Hint, it's Jesus, right? But can you think of one specific example where we can see this? And this is where I'm asking you to read my mind. Now maybe you have your own answer, and I would actually love to hear it. There's probably others. But I'm thinking of one in particular. Vance. Yeah, go ahead. You're allowed to speak now. You've waited long enough.
If man takes, then Christ gives.
Okay. And you're seeing that as like a bigger picture.
Right.
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. Let's narrow it down a little bit to maybe one specific instance within Jesus' life. Yeah. His crucifixion, for sure. So I'm not going to say you're wrong. Let's redirect it maybe a little bit more and focus on like real specific with all these other ones. We had a command, and then they took and then suffered a negative consequence, right? What might the flip side of that look like with Jesus? There's a command or perhaps direction given to him by God. And then what happens?
People accept and are saved.
I'm sorry?
People accept and
Yeah.
are obedient and are saved.
Specifically in Jesus' life, when he receives a command or direction from God. I'll take you to the garden here. What happens? Charlie?
Your will and not my own.
So Jesus appears within this same pattern. and it has an entirely different outcome this time. We read in Luke 22 and verse 39. Jesus is praying. He knows that this is coming. He knows the crucifixion is coming, his betrayal, his arrest, all the torture that's going to go along with this. And as he's praying, I firmly believe that he wanted something else, because otherwise this is my own interpretation, he would not be fully human. No human would want this. Yet he says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me. Take it away from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. And so Jesus overcomes this temptation that the others in this same pattern face. He was faced with an excruciating ordeal that he had the power to change. He said that explicitly when Peter took the sword to Malchus. He could have chosen to have things go the way he wanted, any different way he wanted at all, to not submit to God and to simply enact his own will. Yet even though he had the ability to take what he wanted, he yielded to God's will and obeyed him. And we thank God for Jesus' willingness to submit to God and break the sinful pattern humanity had brought on itself. Jesus resisted temptation, and through his choice, he brought life to sinful man. So any other thoughts about just this one example? Don?
A little further, you asked if we were breaking past a certain change. I don't think we'll change because we're all human. We all sin. Christ was the only one who didn't sin.
Yep.
So the examples you gave us show a consequence. There's always a consequence. Whether no one's around and we don't think, God sees. And a consequence isn't necessarily dealt out at that time. But now with Christ, we have the option to have that consequence forgiven and get excused from it by following and doing
Yeah.
what he wants. So, I mean, but you're not going to change. Man's not going to change. They're always going to want to do what you want to do, even though you know you shouldn't do properly.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to succumb at times.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who didn't hear, Dom brought up that humans will continue to be humans and want to have it their way, but we have a better way now, and that is through Christ. When we do choose that sin, Jesus is there to maybe not make it better, but he's the one who's paying the price. And that's something that we have to come to grips with on our own so that we can stop relying on our own will and turn to his will instead. And that's what I think is so fascinating, and you kind of brought that out, that Jesus becomes that pattern for us now. We can choose to do it like Adam and Eve. We can choose to do it like David. We can choose to do it like Achan, Aaron, and everyone else along the way. But how should we model our lives? It should always be like Jesus did. And that's the thing. We have to deny our will and submit to God's. And like I said, thank God that he did that for us in order to help us become like him. Any other thoughts or comments so far? Yeah.
The other examples you gave, people that enacted the sin probably thought this isn't going to affect anybody else except me. But yet, in some instances, it affected a whole nation.
Yeah, definitely. The fact that these people believe maybe this won't affect everybody, or only I'll know about it and it'll be okay, but instead it has far-reaching implications. And that's what I thought was very curious about Achan's sin and how that affected the nation of Israel. Very interesting. Anything else? We have about 10 minutes, but I have some material that I'm just not going to have enough time to properly go through, so I'm going to end it short unless we want to continue to discuss anything else. Yeah, Rick.
Another example of reversing the pattern is Paul in 2 Corinthians with that thorn in the flesh.
Yeah.
And we're told in verse 8 of 2 Corinthians 12 that Paul pleaded with the Lord 3 times that he take that
Yeah, definitely a fantastic example of how he submitted to God and used that trial, or however you want to describe it, to understand and impart wisdom to us through God. Anything else?
Right here.
Yes, sir.
I was thinking when you look at the way Stephen preached and the way Paul preached, it goes historically to the sins of the people for the most part to lead them to Jesus.
Mhm.
This is why we need Jesus. And these individuals, these scenarios that you describe here, are just small pieces. Small maybe isn't the right word.
Right,
But they're pieces of the puzzle that says you guys cannot do this on your own. You won't anyway.
right.
And so Jesus ties it all together, and that's the answer.
Yeah, definitely. That's one thing I've always come back to. We can't do it on my own ever. And that's, again, thank God we have Jesus to fulfill that for us so that we can put our trust in him and be saved that way. Mary?
Now, when Jesus was praying, and he was asking God not to pass from him, I don't believe that Jesus knew everything that was going to happen to him.
Okay.
He knew he was going to have to suffer. He probably knew the beatings and that stuff. But he didn't know God was going to have to reject him and leave him when he was actually dying on the cross and taking our sins.
Mm.
Because God cannot have sin. So that put him in a position. And I don't think Jesus knew this. I think that's why he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because he didn't really know God was going to.
It's an interesting thought to ponder over about the nature of Christ and how much he knew about his suffering. It's very interesting. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Larry.
Not too often that we have the foresight to actually understand the decisions that we make today, how they might affect us in 10, 20, 30 years. But we can see an example that Joseph, he was sold by his brothers to the Midianites. And from all the things that Joseph had to suffer through, we understand that he was faithful. I'm sure he sinned and had mistakes, but we understand that, the ones that we know of, he was able to be above some of the temptations that were thrown at him. And in the end, in Genesis chapter 45, he tells his brothers, he says, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me here." So he understood why it happened, many years later.
Right.
It was God's design.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to understand.
Yeah.
There's a reason.
Yeah. There's a reason, there's a pattern, and ultimately it can be our choice. Joseph could have given up and died, or turned to pagan gods, or just done nothing at all, but he still held faith in God, and ultimately that's what saw him through, obeying him. So anything else? All right. Thank you all so much for your opinions, your comments, and the discussion. I've really enjoyed it. We're going to cover, maybe not the last half. It's a shorter section, but I just time to cover it. So we'll cover a little bit more of this and then move on to a new subject in the same class next week. So thank you so much.